Thank you. I want to speak tonight on a proposal that LaRouche has made in the last couple of weeks for the convening of an international conference to establish a universal standard for economic value. And this is probably one of the most important initiatives that LaRouche has initiated, and it comes at a very, very crucial time. And we have to immediately come to some international agreement on this understanding, because the alternative is the potential extinction of mankind. Now, it may seem a little bit strange to some people why, in a period like this, given all the tensions in the world and so forth, LaRouche would call for this emergency conference to deal with what appears to be a theoretical question that would be of interest only to technical experts on economics. But in fact, it's this issue which gets at the nub of everything that's happening in the world. So what I intend to do this evening is to set the stage for this and then point to some initial ideas about what the parameters should be for establishing this concept of universal economic value. The need for this immediately is already indicated by the fact that the current standard of economic value no longer functions. And the standard that is generally accepted here in Germany, in Europe in general, also in the United States and London, is a false standard of economic value based on money. When you try and value economic activity, it's always delineated in terms of money. And it doesn't matter what currency you're talking about, whether you do it in dollars, whether you do it in euros, whether you do it in gold, whether you do it in some other type of money. Money no longer functions and never did function as a standard of economic value. But now it's completely finished, because the transatlantic system, the European system, the US system, the British system is completely bankrupt. There is no possible way to provide any economic value of any relevance to anything going on in the transatlantic system. There's more than quadrillion dollars in paper, in money values. Now we don't even use paper. I know people in Germany are easy to talk to about the transitoriness of money values because of the experience of the 1920s. But back then, at least they printed money on paper. And when you say the money wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, the paper was worth something. Today, the money is no longer printed on paper, except for a very small percentage of it. Most of it is just, magnetic deposits on disk drives somewhere. And this can be wiped out with a powerful magnet very, very quickly. It's you can't even say the money's not even worth the disk drive it's printed on, but it doesn't even exist. In the last 7 years, the ECB and the Federal Reserve Board have been creating money without even having to go through the trouble of printing it. There's no cost. Money can be created with just a stroke of a computer keyboard and the proper passwords. So this is now amounted to $4 quadrillion, and yet this completely fictitious entity, which is somehow accepted because the same entry is on various computer disks all in different places in the world, is considered to be sacrosanct over and above the actual conditions of life for the people in the world. And when you look at this situation, you see that the continued attempt to give value to something which has no value at all, as Pope Francis recently said, is an economy that kills. And we have to speak in those terms because that's what's happening. You look at the effect, I know here in Europe, in Southern Europe, but also even here in Germany, you look at the United States. Take, for example, the current situation with Argentina, where you have a nation which is a productive nation. It's the eighth largest in land area in the world. Most of that land area is extremely productive. It's one of the biggest agricultural producers in the world. It's a nation with an educated population. It's a nation with technical capabilities. And yet, it has been bedeviled by financial pressures for decades. In 2005, 2001 and 2005, Argentina took control of their own financial system, renegotiated their debt, got acceptance from 95.3% of their creditors, and a small group of vulture funds, based primarily in London and New York, purchased some of the debt. They weren't even the original lenders to the country. They took the debt. They then sued in an American federal court for full payment on that debt. The case has been going on now for 5-6 years, and it's now finally come to a conclusion where, based on the rulings of a federal judge, which have been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, these small entities think they have the legal authority to bring down the entire nation of Argentina by demanding full payment on the debt. The Argentina has made its payments to its restructured creditors, and yet the judge in New York has barred the Bank of New York from distributing those payments unless it pays $1.5 billion to this small group of vulture funds. And were they to pay that, it would trigger then renegotiate. All the restructured creditors would be triggered out, would be triggered for full payment, and the whole economy of the country would become unraveled, and the vulture funds would make a profit of about 1,500% on 4 years of investment. Okay, now how can that be just? How can the legal authority to a piece of paper, which is probably not even a piece of paper, it's probably an electronic document, have the legal weight and authority to bring down the eighth largest productive nation on the planet? This obviously is just one little example, and we could probably talk all night about example after example after example that indicates that the entire financial monetary system in the transatlantic zone is finished. It doesn't exist. And yet you have the politicians in Germany, the government, Merkel, you have Obama in the United States, are proceeding as if they're still in power, as if they control something, as if this is actually the reality of the world. Now look at what's happening elsewhere in the world. Just about 2 weeks ago, there was a conference in Brazil of the so-called BRICS nations: Russia, China, India, South Africa, Brazil. Argentina was represented. They have, for some time now, been pushing in a completely different direction. And these countries, of course, represent about 42% of the world's population. They represent the largest countries, and they represent countries with an advanced economic, technological, scientific capability. They established a new development bank with an initial capitalization of over $100 billion, which would be headquartered in Shanghai, China. The first president of it will be a rotating presidency. The first president will be India, and they intend to fund with this. It's open to every country, and they intend to fund with this big development projects. We had some initial discussions of reports of what some of these projects might be. And they include things like a new sea level canal across Nicaragua to replace the Panama Canal, which is right now being invested in by China and Russia. They include high-speed rail projects throughout Asia, Africa. The Chinese have already said they want to invest in a rail system which will connect every African capital to each other. We saw earlier this year the gas deal between Russia and China, and so on and so forth. So there's many projects that are ripe for development in this area, and we've put together some of our own, which most of you are probably familiar with. This Eurasian Land Bridge project, the tunnel project across the Bering Strait connecting Russia with Alaska and North America, and other projects of that type. And then this is combined with a commitment on the part of these countries for advanced scientific development. The most notable of this is the Chinese lunar exploration project. Earlier this year, the Chinese landed successfully a rover on the moon, which was very successful and produced a lot of interesting results. And they announced earlier this week that in 2017 they're going to send another rover, which will have the capacity to dig 6 feet. Gets us 2 meters under the lunar surface and bring back many tons of lunar material for analysis back to Earth. And they've announced their intention to mine the moon for helium-3. Helium-3 is a rare isotope of helium that's very rare on the Earth because it's produced in the sun and is deflected by the Earth's ionosphere. But the moon has no magnetic field and no ionosphere, and so the lunar surface is filled with helium-3. And helium-3 is a perfect fuel for advanced fusion reactors. The Chinese estimate that there's enough helium-3 on the moon to power all mankind at a rising standard of living and population level for at least 10,000 years. This is the way the Chinese are thinking. This is the way the Russians are thinking. This is the way Argentina is thinking. This is the way Brazil is thinking. This is the way India is thinking. And when when I come to Germany, when I'm home in the United States, this is not the way people in Germany and the United States and Western Europe are thinking. They're thinking we must get paid on our debt. They're thinking that Greece has to cut back and implement more austerity because they owe money to the banks. And these are contracts which have to be paid. And after all, they borrowed the money. And after all, they used it for big fat social programs and they didn't pay their taxes and they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And the Spanish have to pay and the Portuguese have to pay. And everybody must pay their debts. So you see the contrast here. The tension that's really in the world today is the tension between this false idea of value, which is being enforced by a crumbling power structure in Europe and the United States, which is really the crumbling of the old British Empire. And on the other hand, you have a different idea of value, which is expressed by these new developments in the so-called BRICS countries. That is indicated by what I just described in terms of these great projects and what China is talking about. And that's why you have conflict in the world right now. The conflict you see everywhere, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in East Asia, is about this. The British Empire is crumbling, and they want to use war and the threat of war to force submission on the part of these other countries to this British Empire system. The problem is, if they submit to the British Empire system, they lose everything. Why should they? You take Ukraine. Why would, why should Ukraine join the EU and not be in economic relations with Russia? If I were Ukrainian, I would be appalled. What do you get for the EU? You get what Greece gets. You get what Spain gets. You get what Portugal gets. You get nothing but looting. It was very funny because just 2 days ago there was a vote in the Ukrainian parliament. This is a bankrupt country, which is the standard of living is collapsing, although it's not a country without capability. After all, we in the United States buy our rocket engines from Ukraine. This is not a low-tech country. This is a country with a great capability, a great agricultural capability, a great industrial capability. And yet the current government in Ukraine, which are the descendants of the followers of Hitler, that's who they are. Let's say it openly. These were the people who were the supporters of the Nazis in World War II. And they're there in the power of Ukraine. What did they do? They passed a bill to have an increased tax on the people of Ukraine to pay the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. For what? For the privilege of implementing more austerity on their own people. So they're asking their own people who are suffering to pay more money in order to be able to suffer more. And the Prime Minister of Ukraine, Yats, who was put in there by Victoria Nuland, proudly proclaims, the most important news in the world today is that Ukraine didn't default and Argentina did. So this is exemplary of the insanity which is gripping the transatlantic system. And that's why there's war. Because the British Empire believes that they can, if they push this war confrontation, wherever they can, it doesn't matter where, there are local predicates for what triggers this thing. But it's no more the cause of war than the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand 100 years ago was the cause of the war which supposedly began yesterday, 100 years ago. That war began, as LaRouche has emphasized, in 1890, when Bismarck was sacked, because he had proposed an economic alliance with Russia and no war. And Bismarck did this as in coordination with the followers of Abraham Lincoln, who had succeeded during the American Civil War of establishing in North America the program of the American Founding Fathers and of John Quincy Adams for the United States to be a continental power. And that meant developing the interior of the continent, which is the only way you can have an expansion of the population and the economic capability. It's in the continental interiors in the 19th century that meant the potential for increased development of mankind. We did this in North America with the Transcontinental Railroad, with the development of the agriculture in the interior, with big water projects and so on and so forth. And that was transferred to Europe in the mid-19th century, with particularly alliances between Germany and Russia for economic development of the Eurasian continent, which was expressed by things like the Trans-Siberian Railroad and other, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, and other type of economic development projects. And the British Empire said, no, we're not going to, if you allow the economic development of North America and the Americas and Eurasia, then we, the power of finance and sea power, disappear. And we're not going to let that happen. So how are we going to prevent it? We're going to prevent it by war. And if you look at the history, that's when World War I began. It began with regional wars, like the Russo-Japanese War, the invasion of Japan into China, the Balkan Wars, wars in the Ottoman, the so-called Ottoman Empire, which today are comprises the Middle East, the same regions of the world in which there are wars today. Those are those regional wars, which everybody treated separately. It's a war between Russia and Japan. It's a war over the Balkans. It's a war over this. It's a war over that. And yet that wasn't what the wars were about. Those were wars that were part of a strategy of the British Empire to prevent the continental development. And that war is still going on to this day, if you actually think about it, right? It lasted for a while. People got exhausted. There was a brief truce, and then it started again in 1939. We now call that World War II. But then after World War II, Roosevelt had the intention that this would be the end. Because, why? Because he said, I'm going to dismantle the empires. He told that to Churchill. He said, we're going to dismantle the British Empire, we're going to dismantle the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the Dutch Empire. All these colonies are going to disappear. They're going to become sovereign, independent nations, and we're going to give them the capability to develop the way we just got out of a crisis in the United States. And he also had agreements with Russia, at the time the Soviet Union, that this would be a policy between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was no need for a Cold War. There was no need for the regional wars. Roosevelt had every intention of preventing that. But Churchill deliberately delayed the war so that there would be more killing, especially between Russia and Germany. And then Roosevelt would die. And he could put in a pro-British president of the United States by the name of Harry Truman, who then subsequently adopted the Roosevelt policy of British brains, American brawn, together will rule the world. And since that time, there's only been a couple of presidents in the United States who have bucked the British Empire. And that's Kennedy, who was assassinated. And then nobody really, as a policy, although there were a couple of potential shifts that were engineered by LaRouche during the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s. But in this 21st century, we've had nothing but British control over American policy with Bush and Obama. And the two are the same, although Obama might be even worse. And that's the reality of the situation that we're in right now. That if we don't have what LaRouche is called for here, a change in what a new direction in the idea of economic value, then we will have this continued war. And the danger is, the very real danger and the very immediate danger is that will mean the extinction of mankind. Because every war, if it's allowed to continue, will always escalate to the most advanced weaponry. The history of warfare always shows that. That was the case in World War I, it was the case in World War II, it was the case in the Persian wars of ancient times. If you allow war to continue, the people fighting that war will always ultimately they will deploy the most advanced weapons they have. And the most advanced weapons we have right now are thermonuclear weapons. And there's enough thermonuclear weapons between the United States, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and everybody else who has them, Israel, that the entire human population could be extinct. And if a nuclear war starts, that's where it ends. There's no tactical nuclear war. There's no partial nuclear war. One side can't launch a nuclear strike on a few cities of another side and expect to have peace negotiations after that. Once nuclear war begins, it doesn't end until everybody's extinct. And that only takes a few hours. There's no time for second thoughts. You look at it's interesting today, just parenthetically, because we have all these reports in the newspapers of the timetable and the discussions and so forth that went on in July and August of 1914. I mean, they had months to make stupid proposals back and forth. The funniest thing were these letters between Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas that were published just last Sunday in the Washington Post. They were cousins, both grandsons of Paul I and nephews and grandsons of Queen Victoria and King George V of England. They write to each other in English. They call each other Willie and Nicky, and they say, dear Willie, I know your people are upset about this assassination, but you can't back Austria, we'll go to war. Signed, Nicky. And dear Nicky, I understand you're under pressure. This is stupidness, right? But this is the kind of thing you see happening. This went over weeks, and then the war starts, and then the war goes on. That's not going to happen with nuclear war. You're not going to have a series of telegrams back and forth or phone conversations between Obama and Putin. I'm about to launch a nuclear strike against you. It's going to happen suddenly. And this could break out tomorrow. I mean, I'm not saying it will break out tomorrow, but I'm saying the world is that unstable that there is no way to put any controls in there that will prevent it from happening. We just went through an experience, right, in Ukraine, where all of a sudden you have this, the thing seems to be cooling down a bit, and then boom, you get the shooting down of this plane. And, there's no reason. I mean, the propaganda that came out after that just shows you that these guys are geared towards war, because it's all one-sided. Oh, Putin did it, Putin did it. And yet there's no evidence of that whatsoever. They don't present any evidence, but yet there's plenty of evidence that's coming out that it might have been the Ukrainian military or someone else. But the fact of the matter is that shows you how quickly a situation can turn. Look at the situation in Gaza right now with Israel. And so this situation is so tense that you're on a hair trigger for nuclear war, and the only responsible position to take is that it could happen tomorrow. That doesn't mean it will happen tomorrow, but it's that tense that it could, and therefore it could happen at any time, and so we have to immediately remove this tension, break this tension. And you're not going to break this tension any other way than dealing with what the cause of the tension is. And the cause of the tension is the insistence on the British Empire and its Wall Street and London banks to protect the value of this worthless money and prevent what actually is a future progress for mankind represented by the BRICS development. So therefore we have to have LaRouche's intervention into this process, I think, it shows his skill as a statesman, which he's demonstrated over the years. He's almost 92 years old now, but I've been working with LaRouche now for more than 40 years. And I can tell you that during that entire period, he's always come up with brilliant interventions which point the way to completely getting out of these kinds of crises. We can go through the history if you want at some point, but the intervention he makes now is brilliant, which is how do we let's have an international conference and establish a real universal concept of what is economic value. And that begs the question, what are the parameters? What's the direction? If money is not economic value, how are we going to come to some agreement as to what is economic value so that we can have some basis for negotiations among nations for an actual future? And for this, we have to look at certain key breakthroughs in science, because we've already agreed that you cannot delineate economic value in monetary terms. But I take a very broad meaning of that concept of monetary terms. I don't mean just you can't do it in dollar terms and replace the dollar with some other currency or basket of currencies or gold currencies or so forth. Nor can you determine economic value based on, nor is would it be right to base it on something like physical terms, like energy or goods produced or something like that. There are all these different kinds of proposals. But it requires us to actually reflect on what really is an economy. what really is the economic development. And for that, we have to look at the progress which has been made in that direction over the centuries, especially from the time of the 14th and 15th century European Renaissance to the present. And it was it was clearly recognized. You had a similar situation. If you look at the end of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, you had a similar situation to today, except not as dangerous. You had the total collapse of the financial system, and the total physical economy was completely wiped out. And this led to what today we call sometimes the Black Plague, the period of the Great Death in Europe, where 50% of the European population died out in about a 3-year period. And in fact, if you make a chart of the population growth, human population growth, from thousands of years ago to the present, you'll see it goes very, very slow. And then, even with that large scale, the population collapse in those 3 years between 1347 is so big that it actually shows up on that big scale. And then all of a sudden you have a huge increase in population. What happened then? What happened was the power of the financial oligarchy, the ancestors of the British Empire, and they were the direct ancestors of the British Empire, because the British Empire is not centered in London. It just happened to take control of London at some point with the so-called Glorious Revolution of William of Orange being brought in to be the king, William and Mary to be the king and queen of England. They picked that as their seat, but it doesn't come from Britain. It comes from this whole Venetian empire system, which needed to break out of the Mediterranean and get into the Atlantic domain. So they moved slowly into Holland and became the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch Financial Center, which then took over the London Financial Center around that period in the 17th century. And so the ancestors of the current British Empire were completely bankrupt. And a small handful of people, particularly led by the Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, recognized that this was an opportunity to shift the idea of economic value from money to the mind. And they had to demonstrate and to coordinate the idea that the real source of economic value is in the creative powers of the human mind. If you want to improve human society, you improve the powers of the mind. And all the necessary physical improvements follow from improvements of the human mind. Cusa developed the concepts on which this was based. But you see it also expressed, for example, in the great construction of the by Brunelleschi of the dome. I'm just looking around for a picture of it. I don't see it here. Of the oh no. Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, on the back there. The dome in Florence over the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, which was, a project that was begun long before the collapse. And it sat there unfinished with this huge vault uncovered. And the question was, how do you actually construct something that would a dome for it? Because all previous domes that had been built of that, there was only one actually of that size, which was the Pantheon in Rome, was built with a huge structure outside that held it up. So inside there was a dome, but outside it was very ugly and so forth. And Brunelleschi showed that you could conceive of an idea You could imagine a state of nature, a physical state that had never existed before in the world. And you could take an idea which was conceived in the mind and turn it into a reality. And you just think about that process. He had this idea of how to build this dome using a physical principle, which today is, we would call the catenary principle, based on the principle of the hanging chain, which is a physical characteristic of that's self-sustaining, so that the structure holds itself up by its own characteristics. The way a chain, when you hang a chain, the chain forms a shape so that the interaction between the material parts of the chain and gravity are equalized throughout the whole chain. And the chain does this naturally. It's a physical principle. It's not a construction. But Brunelleschi figured out how to take that principle and turn it into a surface and construct a dome that would be self-sustaining, so that you could use what you had already built as the structure for what you were about to build. Right? There was no scaffolding, there was no superstructure that held the thing up. The dome held itself up while it was being built. They built part of it, and then you stand on what you just built to build the next. And you stand on that to build the next, and you stand on that to build the next, which becomes very scary when you get to a very high part of the dome as it begins to turn in very, very, at a very steep angle. So you're hanging on this stuff that's not finished, and yet that is secure enough for you to use as your step for the next part. Now think about that, right? That requires not only Brunelleschi having the idea, but being able to communicate that idea to the people who are actually going to build the thing with such confidence that they would risk their lives based on an idea. And it was an idea to bring about a new condition which doesn't exist. That gets at the core of what you have to look at to understand economic value. And it's a unique characteristic of human beings, which is mankind lives in the future, not in the present or the past. And all progress in mankind is based on our ability to actually think from the future. And if you look at Brunelleschi's construction here, Brunelleschi had an idea of a future state. There's the famous story, I'll tell it even though people probably have heard it, of when there was the argument about who was going to build the dome. And Brunelleschi, they said, what's your proposal? And he said, I'm not going to tell you, because if I tell you, you won't understand it, or you'll try and steal it from me and screw it up. So I propose a contest, which is anybody who can make an egg stand on its end should get the contract. So all the people who were competing for the contract came there, and they played around with this egg, and it always fell over. So Brunelleschi came his time to show what he had to do, and he cracked the end of the egg and smashed the shell, and it stood straight up. And people said, well, I could do that. And he said, yeah, you could do that, but you didn't. And I did. It's a funny story, but it demonstrates a quality of mind, right? Which is, you think of a future condition. Everybody else was saying, make an egg stand on its end. They were thinking about the present as if it was a continuation of the past. They were stuck of thinking about the physical world from the domain of sense perception. Whereas Brunelleschi was thinking about the future from the standpoint of thinking of the present from the standpoint of the future. I'm going to bring into existence a new condition which doesn't exist. Now, that's an illustration of this principle that guides us to what we have to think about in terms of what economic value is. And we can get other guidance. We can get a lot of guidance from, say, Leibniz, who also expanded on Kuhse's ideas and was very much responsible for developing these ideas into a modern concept of physical economy. And Leibniz's ideas were later organized into an actual system of physical economy by the great genius, founder of the economic system of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, who was faced with this situation similar to what we're faced with today, which is the United States had achieved its independence, but the question was, could it sustain itself as a nation? It lacked everything that nations up till then had, that the great powers had. They had money, they had armies, they had navies, America had one thing, and that was the minds of its people, the ingenuity of its people. And Hamilton figured out how to turn that into an actual functioning economy. And he did that by saying, okay, we don't have money, but we have credit. And the credit is the ability to conceive of a future condition which doesn't exist. And the government can set up a national bank, which is not a money bank, but is a credit bank, whose purpose is to create future economic growth. And it's very interesting. You can actually see this concept even embedded in the language we use. The word in English for credit comes from the Latin word credo, which means to believe. And in German, I believe you use the word glaube ich, right, for credit. But the word for debt is Schuld. It's a chain to the past. So Hamilton is not talking about a debt system, which is a system to perpetuate the past into the future, like what they're trying to do to Argentina. You must be chained to your past. Well, the past of Argentina is pretty bad, but the future is very good. Hamilton said we have a credit system which is based on the future. So we established a national bank to focus the credit, the belief in progress. And what was that belief in that period of time, in the end of the 18th century? Was that these little colonies, which were stuck up against the Atlantic seaboard, would break over the mountains into the continent of North America and harness the entire continent. And that was the vision. And for that they needed canals, they needed means of transportation, they needed investment. In fact, the issue over which this national bank was created, and in fact the issue over which the American Constitution was created, was the construction of a canal from Washington through the mountains into the Ohio area. Never actually got built because the railroads came along too fast. But that was the issue. How do we build transportation systems to get into the interior of the continent for the economic development of the continent? And so Hamilton gives us a still usable model of how to take this idea of an economy based on the future and put it into actual practice in terms of a functioning financial system. And the next breakthrough in terms of economic understanding in this direction comes from a Ukrainian-Russian scientist named Vladimir Vernadsky, who was a student of Mendeleev and who understood the ideas, was a very thorough investigator of the development of the Earth. And what he recognized was that when you look at the development of the Earth as a physical process, you see two things. First of all, you see that there's a physical capacity, a physical part of the Earth, a domain which we consider to be abiotic. And that domain is associated with extremely energetic types of processes. Earthquakes, volcanoes, big energetic types of processes. But those energetic processes are not the most powerful force on the planet. And those seemingly powerful energetic processes are actually brought under submission by what appears to be a very weak process, which is distinct from those abiotic processes, which is the power of life. And if you look at how life develops over the history of the development of the planet, it's the action of living things which are distinguished from these non-living parts of the Earth, which transform the non-living parts of the Earth into different forms which don't exist. For example, to make soil. Soil comes from rocks. You can't grow anything in the rocks. Living things can't really live in rocks, but living things can break rocks into soil and produce a complete change in the chemical composition of the planet itself. And over a long period of time, living organisms, beginning with very primitive living organisms and going up to more advanced plants and animals, that living processes become the dominant force on the planet and actually change and create new forms of planetary action which don't exist outside the domain of life. He points out to a very ironical thing, that living organisms, non-living organisms have no boundaries, right? Rocks just spread out, water spreads out, air spreads out. But living organisms always have a boundary. There's an inside and an outside to a living organism. When you start to investigate it, it's not so clear what the boundary is. That's another question. But living organisms seem to have an inside, they seem to have a limitation, and yet they interact with the environment around them to transform the environment around them. And so you have what he calls the transmigration of atoms, where living organisms bring in, for example, hydrogen and nitrogen and other elements from the surrounding area, abiotic, actually transform those elements into new chemical substances. And those chemical substances then are excreted by the living organism, and then the living organisms die, and that becomes a new form of existence that didn't exist in the abiotic domain. When we go to Mars, so far, we haven't found any evidence of the action of life on this abiotic domain of Mars. That doesn't mean we won't, but so far we haven't found it. But on Earth, you see something completely different, where there's no part of the Earth, at least in this huge envelope from, say, the stratosphere all the way down to deep below the Earth's surface. The farther we dig below the Earth's surface, the more we find life. forms of life we didn't think existed. You go way deep down into the ocean, into these ocean vents, or dig these big holes in Antarctica. We're finding at the bottom of these, very deep holes, living organisms which don't exist on the surface. So life seems to have a huge envelope here, right? But then there's a unique form of life, human life. And this unique form of human life has a capability that no other living form has, which we have a mind. Other forms of animals have a type of mind. We know that by our interaction with animals, right? But it's different than the human mind in that the human mind can conceive of still new forms that don't exist and create those as permanent things. For example, bronze doesn't exist in the Earth's crust. It's a compound made only by man. It's a new substance. It doesn't exist in the universe. It didn't exist on the planet Earth until man figured out how to use copper and tin, mix them together and make a substance, bronze, and use that new substance for further transformation of the Earth. The same thing with even simpler elements. Iron doesn't exist, or rarely exists, as an independent element. It's always in some type of mineral mixed in with some other elements, right? But man takes iron, and it takes iron ore and turns it into iron and makes implements with it and further transforms the universe. So when you look at the planet Earth, you see that its evolution is now being guided by ideas, by the ability of the mind to bring into existence new substances, new forms of existence, which do not exist until the mind comes up with these ideas. And this Vernadsky called the noosphere, the sphere of knowledge, the sphere of the mind. Now, this is a very interesting, that's basically, Vernadsky, came up with this idea. But its elaboration, he didn't get that much further because he died in 1945. But LaRouche has advanced this even further. Because when we look at how this noosphere works, you find that the mind conceives of two kinds of things, two kinds of new states. One is new states of nature, such as the examples I gave, bronze and new forms of matter. We now create new elements that don't exist, for example. But the mind also conceives of new states of mind. And we heard examples of this earlier tonight with these musical compositions. These are not new states of matter. These are new understandings of the way the mind works. When you hear these pieces of Bach or Mozart or poems of Schiller, we can think of new ways of thinking, new capacities of the mind, which didn't previously exist until these great artists conceived of them. And here, even though there's hundreds of years later, these new states of mind still guide us to be able to think of further states of mind. The other characteristic of mind, which is essential to developing a new theory of economic value, is illustrated by what I just discussed, which is how these ideas are perpetuated beyond the life of the living organism which generated those ideas. Just as a living organism, through its migration of atoms, changes the chemical composition of its own environment, the mind generates ideas, and long after the body dies, those ideas are still active in human culture. So we have a capacity to concentrate ideas across generations, so that, for example, in the 21st century, we can, in a proper education system of a small percentage of an individual's life, assimilate thousands and thousands of years of human ideas as a platform for the generation of higher ideas. And that platform can be then communicated as a new platform for the generation of even further ideas, right? So this is another important characteristic to be conscious of the human mind, is that the ideas, the generation of new ideas always occur within an individual human mind. LaRouche once addressed a group of scientists in Russia, and he stunned them by saying that science is the process of proving the way everybody else thinks is wrong, which is what science is. Every new discovery of science proves that what everybody believed before was wrong. Einstein proved everybody was wrong. Kepler proved everybody was wrong. This is what a scientist loves to do, not to validate what everybody already knows, as our current peer review system of science sort of does. You know, you submit a new discovery, and then it has to be judged by the popular scientific opinion to see whether it conforms to what everybody thinks is right. But the real science is the guy who proves everybody is wrong. And but that discovery comes from taking into the individual mind the fruits of all these ideas from the past, and then adding it to a new capacity into the future. And all scientists, if you read and artists as well, if you read what they say about themselves, they always talk about how they are motivated not by the present but by the future. I'm going to change the way mankind for all time will think about things. And they know when they do that at some point in time, they will be, their ideas will be subsumed in a higher idea which they had no capability of thinking of, right? So this is where we must locate economic value. In this quality of the mind, to think about the future. This defies all attempts to use statistical methods or mathematical methods or some linear method, any mathematical method, to come up with some unit of value. The effect of this power of the mind is expressed in the results of economic activity as increases in what LaRouche calls potential relative population density, which is not the population density, but the potential population density relative to the level of technology. For example, in the western parts of the United States, it's very dry, right? And it's especially dry right now. So the potential population density there is very low unless you have a program for water development and power development, which then produces which increases that potential to a higher level. So it's expressed as an increase in potential relative population density, and also in the form of what LaRouche has identified as energy flux density, which is the density of power available per operative per unit area. The greater power available in a concentrated way, the more efficient and powerful your technologies are. So if you look at the history just of energy development from, burning wood to coal to oil to nuclear to thermonuclear fusion, you see these are characterized by an increase in energy flux density. And that's why we absolutely have to get to fusion power, because it's only with fusion power that you get the level of energy flux density that can actually lift man to the next higher level. But these are effects. We have to discuss these things in this international conference. But the real thing that we have to come to an international agreement for is a concept of economic value based on this idea of human creativity and this idea of the mind. Such a undertaking is obviously extremely ambitious. Just the thought of thinking of convening experts from many different countries to discuss how do we have a common understanding that this is the only source of economic value seems quite daunting, but that's why LaRouche proposed it. Because it's only if we shift into that domain completely that we have any hope of avoiding the catastrophe that I discussed at the beginning. And that's what I hope everybody joins us in doing here in Germany. I've been here now for almost 3 weeks. I'll be here for another week. And I think over the next immediate period ahead, this is what we should focus our attention on. Organizing being two things. One is facing the reality of the situation we're in today. But we cannot become paralyzed by that. We have to face that situation squarely, but then act. Not act in a defensive way. It's not good enough just to oppose what's bad. That won't stop the bad from becoming worse. The only thing that will do that is to actually have a real concept of what's good. And for that, LaRouche's intervention here for an international conference and discussion on what really is economic value is, for today, what the Council of Florence was in 1437 that saved mankind then. So that's my proposal, and be happy to have whatever discussion you want.